We're all set?
Greetings, welcome everyone. I'm Albert Liu for Rule Classroom, here as usual with Rick Rule, and today we have a special guest, David Stockman, who is a senior scholar at the Brownstone Institute, where he, along with Jeffrey Tucker and others, do extraordinary work. He's a former congressman from Michigan and former director of the Congressional Office of Management and Budget. He's also the author of several books on politics, finance, and economics, including his most recent book, How to Cut $2 trillion. David, welcome to the Rule Classroom. How are you?
Great. Happy to be here and talking about cutting $2 trillion. That's pretty current. That's where the battle lines lay in Washington today. So I think we got a lot to cover here.
We absolutely do. And Rick has been preparing, eagerly anticipating this interview. So I'm going to turn it over to you right away. Rick, take it away.
Well, thank you, Albert. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You know, so much of the discussion of politics and economics involves around narrative. And there's all kinds of cool narrative around there. The problem is that mathematics gets in the way continually. Today, we're going to talk about the reality of that narrative, which is to say the economic reality of that narrative. We're going to talk about the math of America. We're going to talk about the politics of the problem. And we're going to finish up by asking David what each of us can do individually in terms of our own planning and our financial planning for the future. David, first of all, I'm just delighted that you are with us today. And I'm delighted, too, that you're going to be speaking at the Natural Resources Investment Symposium. I think that the questions that you propose to address are probably the most important questions in front of American voters, in front of American taxpayers, and in front of global investors. So first of all, thank you.
Well, I'm happy to be with you today, and I look forward to the conference. You know, with each passing month and quarter, we're getting closer to the edge here in terms of whether this system is going to blow sky high or not. And I don't see a lot of reason to be encouraged, but I think there's plenty of reason to be prepared, plenty of reason to understand really what's going on, to reject the mainstream narrative, and deal with the math, as you said, the arithmetic, both of our national economy, the global economy, and our fiscal and monetary situation in Washington. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I think we can do it in a reasonable period of time.
Well, I think it's going to be fun to try. It reminds me of the Hemingway quote. How did you go bankrupt? Well, slowly at first, and then all of a sudden.
Right.
When people say to me, so far so good.
Yeah.
Anyway,
wasn't that on the third floor out of a 20-story building? Right. So it was working okay until it wasn't. But I think we're getting to the slowly at first, and all of a sudden we're getting closer to the all of a sudden part here on a lot of things.
Well, let's talk about two books. First of all, I want you to talk about The Triumph of Politics, because you've been through this before. You wrote a book, I think a wonderful book, and I know that's not the book that you're currently excited about, but tell me something about the Triumph of Politics. Tell me something a little bit briefly about this is deja vu for you. You've been here before.
Exactly. I wrote that in 1986 after I left the Reagan administration. It was meant to be a honest, detailed explanation for why the Reagan Revolution, that started with so much promise that we were going to finally, tackle the monster on the Potomac. We were going to shrink the welfare state sharply, cut taxes, get the government out of the way, and unleash a new era of permanent and sustainable prosperity. Well, some very good things happened. I'm not denying that. But in the book, I showed that we ended up not cutting domestic spending very much at all. And that happened because basically, at the end of the day, the Republicans on Capitol Hill talked a good game, but they weren't willing to walk the plank and take the heat when it came to reforming entitlements and cutting back on all the different domestic pork barrels that they like to take home and brag about. And then, of course, we had a massive increase in defense spending. I think it was a total mistake. I laid out some of the reasons in The Triumph of Politics in 1986. And that, of course, offset and then some all of the savings that were made on the domestic side. So we ended up with a drastically out of balance fiscal situation where net spending wasn't cut, defense up too much, domestic barely cut, taxes were cut deeply, the deficit became large, permanent, and chronic. And it should have led to a crisis by the end of the decade at least. And I predicted that in my book, which came out in the spring of 1986. And, here we are 35, 40 years later, and they say, see, you were wrong. And I think it's important to understand, I was wrong in the sense the predicted dire outcomes didn't happen, but there was a reason. And the reason was that we had, when I wrote this book, a pretty sound money man running the Fed. That's Paul Volcker. He did wrestle to ground this, runaway inflation that we had in the 1970s, the double digits that led to like 16% Treasury bond rates and 20% prime rates. And everybody remembers, knows about anyway, all the rest. He accomplished all that, and his reward was he got booted out of the job, and they put Greenspan in instead because some of the White House staffers thought he was more reliable, that he was a historic Republican, and they also thought he was a sound money man, and he wasn't. He had written earlier in his career about the gold standard and all the good, solid stuff that we all believe in, but when he got to the Fed, he wanted to be the toast of the town. He wanted to be a crowd pleaser, and he started us down the path, and this is the key thing, of massive money printing and monetizing the public debt. And what that did was it short-circuited for the time being, the laws of economics. With all that federal borrowing, there should have been a crunch in the bond pit. Supply and demand does not lie. You can't outlaw it. You can't abolish it. It should have led to a soaring yields and interest rates, a financial crunch, a big recession, and a wake-up call for Washington. But instead, Greenspan stepped in, ran the printing press at the Fed for a decade or longer at very rapid rates, bought in much of the debt that was being flooded into the system by lax fiscal policy in Washington. And as a result of that, the day of destiny, the reckoning was deferred, and we ended up with a highly bloated, financially unstable, bubble-ridden, financial system and economy. It created several crises that we all know about that we went through in 2007 and 2008, then again in 2020. But I guess the long and short of it, from my point of view, is that we finally reached the point where the Fed, injected so much cheap credit into the economy, encouraged so much speculation in the financial markets, and I'm talking about stocks and bonds and real estate and derivatives and everything else, that we finally reached the point of unsustainability. And that's why we had, the big inflation in 21 and 22, and why we're kind of stuck high and dry at the moment. So that's kind of a short summary of where we were way back then when I wrote The Triumph of Politics. And it's ironic because here we are today, literally 45 years later, and we have Elon Musk and his Doge team going after the federal agencies and the employment and the waste and fraud and abuse and spending and warning about debt that is out of control, almost like an echo of what we were talking about in 1981. And I think this time is now or never. If the situation isn't fundamentally reformed and shift, and the direction is not basically shifted, I don't think we have another 40 years to print and borrow and pretend our way through it. And the reason I say it, then I'll sort of stop on this part and we can go on, is that the number I remember more than anything else when I joined the Reagan administration in January 1981 was we got a message from the Treasury that the debt ceiling was within a few, $1 billion of being breached, and that Ronald Reagan, who had run on a platform of balancing the budget and capping what was then thought to be the runaway growth of the public debt, would have to raise the public debt ceiling to over $1 trillion. Well, here we are. You're still here. I'm still here. It's not like it was ancient history. And today, obviously, by the time Donald Trump got elected the first time, the debt was 20 trillion. When he left, it was 28. By the time he came back, the second time, it's 37 trillion. So it's 37 times larger than it was then. The GDP might be 8 times larger. So, we're actually on borrowed time. But even more importantly, what's now built in, sort of what I call baked into the cake, the so-called, baseline, CBO baseline, is that we don't change any entitlements. If we keep trying to pretend that we're the policemen of the world and that we're going to maintain the American empire with the defense national security budget of 1.5 trillion, which is where we really are today if you count everything, then we're going to drift down a road towards 70 trillion of public debt by the middle of the next decade, and 150 trillion, which is a number so staggering you can't even put your mind around it, 150 trillion by the middle of the century. Now you can say, well, that's a long way away. Well, 25 years isn't that far. That's 25 years ago, we were celebrating the year 2000 and Y2K. So everybody can remember that. Well, in the next interval of that same period, we would, on paper, unless there's fundamental shift of policy, be at 150 trillion of debt. It would crush the whole system. That would really be the end of times. That would be the end of things, because there's no way that kind of debt could be carried by the U.S. economy. So that's kind of how we got from the triumph of politics to the crisis of the moment.
Oh, a lot of people, when they look at these numbers, first of all, their eyes glaze over. The narrative is easier to understand than the numbers. But the second is that they look at the numbers in isolation. And we're not going to do that in this interview. We're going to get into some numbers later. But I want to talk to you now about your new book. You have been here before, albeit successfully. You had a roadmap for the Reagan administration, which was politically unpalatable. And you have a roadmap, which you've kindly provided to the Trump administration. So perhaps you can talk about that roadmap. Take people at least through the high points, understanding that many people don't know that the entire budget is $2 trillion. Never mind the fact that we need to get $2 trillion out of it.
Yeah. Well, I started, when it became clear that Elon Musk was going to be a major player in the administration, and he began to talk about cutting the government, the federal budget by $2 trillion. I understood that actually was a worthy, necessary goal, but I thought he probably had only limited appreciation because, he's a tech guy, he's a Tesla guy and so forth. It was the right idea, the right direction, and even the right magnitude, but I wasn't sure he understood how difficult it would be to get there or what you needed to do. So I said, let's go back to the game plan from 1981, update all the numbers to this 7 trillion budget we have today with a 2 trillion deficit, and see if we could put together a framework that is comprehensible, that can be communicated and people could understand about what you would need to do step by step, blueprint kind of way to get to the 2 trillion, which I confirmed is a worthy, necessary goal. And let's be very clear here, not over 10 years, but on an annual basis, maybe a couple years down the road, to wrestle this yawning structural deficit to the ground. So what I said, well, why don't we think about it in terms of 3 quantities or 3 baskets: the fat, the muscle, and the bone. And I laid out how we need to go for 400 billion of fat, which is basically excess employment, excess overhead, waste, fraud, and abuse, unneeded programs, unneeded agencies, all of those things that so far DOGE is really focused on, like getting rid of most of foreign aid, shutting down USAID, closing the education department, and so forth. But when I went through everything, and I'll come back to this in a moment, it only added up to 400 billion, which is 20% of the target. So then I said, the next thing we have to understand is the American empire is unaffordable. It's been totally unsuccessful anyway. We've had failure after failure after failure. All these forever wars were not necessary for, protection of the homeland security. It was basically coming out of the power centers of Washington and the neocon theories of how America was destined to run the world, and a lot of baloney like that. And I said, we need to look at this excess muscle that we have today that we don't need for the security and liberty of the American people, that we don't need for a sustainable national security policy, and cut that out. Well, I came up with 500 billion of muscle out of the 1.4 trillion that we now spend on defense, international aid and operations, security assistance, and also for veterans. And the reason I throw the veterans in, they deserve whatever they're getting, I think, mainly. But the veterans budget today is $350 billion. This is just the veterans budget. And in very practical terms, it amounts to the deferred cost of war. In other words, we wouldn't have all these veterans on lifetime disability compensation if we hadn't sent them off to wars that we didn't need to have. We wouldn't have this monster of a veterans healthcare system to take care of, I think it's 4 million veterans today, if that we hadn't sent them to all these wars, from the one that I dodged as a young man in 1968, the Vietnam War, all the way through all the rest of these unnecessary forever wars that we've had. So anyway, I went through all of that, and I can give a couple of highlights to save 500 billion, you have to say, why do we have an army today that costs $200 billion a year? Because if you recognize we shouldn't be invading people all over the world, that World War II ended, 80 years ago, that we shouldn't have 60,000 troops in Europe, and we don't need to have 80,000 in East Asia. If you say, let's bring the empire home, and if you realize we can defend the homeland without an army, because they'll never get here. If you have a proper defense, you sink the armada coming to America, the aircraft carriers and the troop ships before they get here. You don't have hand-to-hand combat in New Jersey or Georgia or whatever. So the point is, you could get rid of 70% of the army and still have a very secure budget, with a national security posture based on nuclear deterrence and homeland, what I call a Fortress America homeland defense with drones and air and sea-based defense. So anyway, without going too much further in that, there's 500 billion of muscle that can be cut and added to the 400 billion fraud, waste, and abuse, and fat. Now, I might say to get to the 400 billion is easy. In the plan that I laid out in this book, you got to get rid of 16 agencies. You do have to do what they're talking about this very day. Shut down the education department. You do have to do what they were talking about last week. Close down USAID. You have to get rid of all these artifacts of empire that we don't need, like the National Endowment for Democracy, like the the Voice of America, and all this obsolete stuff that's no longer necessary. You have to get rid of things like OSHA. We don't need that. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I could go on, but anyway, there's 16 of those agencies you get rid of. Another 9 that you cut by 50%, including IRS, for instance, and the rest of the government, which is 1.3 million employees on the non-defense side, you would cut by 34%. Now, this sounds pretty sweeping. It sounds, I think, a lot of people pretty necessary. But my point is, it only adds up to 130 billion. If you cut all of that manpower in all of those agencies, it would add up to 130 billion, even though you get rid of 530,000 employees. So on top of that, you would have to get rid of all the farm programs that we don't need. You would have to get rid of all of the green energy and black energy, old energy, new energy, all of these subsidies and tax credits. The free enterprise, free market doesn't need any help from Washington and, figuring out where to allocate capital and to produce energy as is demanded in the marketplace. So I propose that we get rid of all of that. I propose that we get rid of these stupid things like the Small Business Administration, the Export-Import Bank that's, makes subsidized loans to GE and Boeing. What the hell do we need to give them subsidized loans for? They can finance their export sales. And if it costs them 2 cents a share, in their earnings, so be it. The taxpayers shouldn't be paying for this. Anyway, when you add all that other stuff that I've kind of skipped over here, you get 400 billion of savings. Now that's kind of sobering. There's a lot of broken furniture in what I've just said, all the way from shutting down the Department of Education to all of these business subsidies. It's only 400 billion. Now the long-term deficit is 2 to 3 trillion a year and growing. And if interest rates ever start rising sharply again, which I think they will, it'll be even a lot more than 3 trillion. So 400 billion of savings in the fat basket that I'm talking about here doesn't get you very far. So we have to throw in the muscle, the 500, and then we're still only halfway to the goal, to the 2 trillion target. So then I laid out how you save 1.1 trillion per year out of the massive part of the budget I call the bone, the entitlements. And that's another considerable discussion. But let's just take one area. The entitlements for poor people. We call them means-tested entitlements. People know what that is. Medicaid, food stamps, housing subsidies, cash assistance, Head Start, a lot of programs like that. We spend 1.1 trillion a year on that. And yet, if we calculate it through, that amounts to about 26,000 per person in America under the poverty line as the U.S. government calculates it. Now, the poverty line is only 14,000 per person, and yet the amount of welfare is 26,000 per person. So, there shouldn't be any poverty in America at all if this money were spent effectively and targeted on people that really need it. Furthermore, I went back to 1980 and I said at the time that we first took this on, and mentioning the book, The Triumph of Politics, I talked a lot about that. We went after reforming the means-tested entitlements. We weren't going to throw truly deserving, needy people out in the snow, but we had some pretty solid, supportable reforms. But at the time, in current dollars, it's the same purchasing power as we have today, constant dollars, so-called $2024 of purchasing power. The means-tested welfare programs back then were well less than 100 billion and well less than 6,000 per poor person in America. So, in other words, when we attacked the welfare state the first time, means-tested spending was 50% of the poverty line. Today, they're coming back 45 years later, and it's 150% of the poverty line. So in the book, we sort of lay out how you could essentially get the federal government out of the poverty program business, out of the means-tested welfare business, put it all in a block grant, send the money back to the states based on the taxes they pay to Washington, sort of, pro rata, proportionately, and then cut the whole thing by 25% and save $250 billion. Now, this is just one of the items that's in this third bucket, which is, as I've called it, cutting the muscle. We also would need to basically have a means test for very affluent people on Social Security. We would need to have sweeping payments reform for Medicare. There's many other lesser things you could do. But if you did these things, you could, save 1.1 trillion. But even then, it would be less than 18% of total total welfare spending. So to summarize, you take the fat, you take the muscle, you take the bone, you work all of these things that are laid out. They're not that complicated, by the way. The book is only 100 pages longer, so lays it all out in the numbers. You could save 2 trillion. I sent it down to Washington. I haven't heard a peep.
So, David, there's a lot in what you have to say that people can hate. Rich guys like me that paid into Social Security say, I paid into it, I'm due. People don't want to see poor people. Other people want to screw around with other countries and have a big defense budget. A lot I hear to hate. So let's talk about the why. And let's really, truly talk about the numbers.
Sure.
I'm going to give you and the audience a few numbers to quantify the problem and quantify the outcome of the problem. Because what you propose to cut, people don't like. They don't like it in isolation. They don't like it because they don't consider the alternatives. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of numbers. You don't have to remember all of them because you get them. But the audience needs to play this again.
Yeah.
The first number, my top number, comes from Internal Revenue Service. They estimate that the aggregate private net worth of all Americans, all the money that we have privately, is $141 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Their numbers, not Rick Rule's numbers. The people who oppose your plans say, well, all we have to do is tax the billionaires. The IRS says that the aggregate net worth of all of American billionaires is $6.7 trillion. So never mind if we tax them, if we took all their money, comparing the $6.7 trillion to the problem tells you something. Now the ugly numbers. Gross federal revenue before the government spends a dime in 2024 was $5 trillion.
Yep.
Gross federal expenditures was $6.9
Right.
trillion. So obviously a $1.9 trillion deficit. Now the numbers get truly ugly. Aggregate federal on balance sheet liabilities, the money that we owe the bondholders, $36 trillion against $7 trillion of the Fed's own budget. So a $29 trillion net on balance sheet problem, which is the problem that you've been talking about so much.
Yep.
Rather than dealing with it, of course, that number gets bigger by almost $2 trillion a year. But let's move on to a bigger problem just for fun. The Congressional Budget Office suggests that the net present value, not the nominal value, the net present value of our off-balance sheet liabilities, the federal pensions you talked about, the military pensions, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, not my numbers, not even your numbers. The Congressional Budget Office suggests that the net present value of those unfunded obligations exceeds $100 trillion a year.
Right. Right.
Congressional Budget Office also suggests that that number gets larger by between $2 and $2.5 trillion a year. This seems to me to be a problem. It seems to me that even if you cut $2 trillion out of the budget, you haven't dealt at all with $29 trillion in net debt or $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And if you add the increase in on-balance sheet liabilities, which is, let's call it $2 trillion to make the math easy, and off-balance sheet liabilities, which is another $2 trillion a year, we're getting $4 trillion behind the eight ball every year against aggregate government income before they spend a dime of $4 trillion a year. In other words, you run all the rest of the programs combined for $1 trillion a year, impossible,
Yep.
and you don't deal with the debt. And I have one more thing. Well, no, let's stop there.
Yeah.
Stop there. We've made our audience sick enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're 130 trillion upside down. We get $4 trillion deeper upside down annually. Our gross federal income is $5 trillion, and our gross federal expenditures are $6.9 trillion. The politics of dealing with this arithmetic, you went through the politics once.
Yep.
You had a road plan 40 years ago that had they followed it, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. Is there or could there be will on the part of the voters? Could there be the will on the part of our elected and unelected government officials? Let's leave it there. That's a big enough topic.
Well, that's a huge topic. It is also the $60 trillion question, to use an old phrase. I don't see a lot of reason to be optimistic that they're going to, grab this problem by the horns and wrestle it to the ground anytime soon. On the other hand, I don't think that a democracy that we have in America is totally incapable of responding if the crisis gets severe enough, obvious enough, and unsettling enough. So we're not there yet, but I could imagine at some point we would be. And then people will say, we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And what is a fair mix of entitlement reforms, shrinking the warfare state, that is bringing the empire home, and a huge cutback and house cleaning in all of these superfluous domestic programs and agencies. And if they were willing to do all that, you could then have a trade-off saying, all right, we'll throw some additional revenues into the mix, but only if we can get the 2 trillion or at least something close to that of spending cuts first. Now, I actually laid out a plan to do this recently. I put it in my daily newsletter. And it does show that there is a path to get to a balanced budget by 2029.
But if you get to a balanced budget,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this actually concerns me. If you do get to a balanced budget, David, how do you deal with the net present value of unfunded entitlement liabilities? How do you deal with
because to get to the balanced budget, you need, as I just laid out, $1 trillion a year of permanent entitlement reforms. And on a present value basis, that is worth, 50, 60, 70 trillion in present value. If you can sustain, if you do, you'd have to assume you sustain it for the next 70 years. That's where these present value numbers come from. They say, let's take the policy we have today, let's project it forward 70 years, add up all the numbers and bring them back to present value with some discount rate. So surprisingly, the off-balance sheet, not part of this that you're talking about, would be automatically cured for the most part if you balance the budget, because you can't get to a balanced budget without sweeping reform of the entitlements, Medicare, Social Security, and the lesser entitlements.
Be prepared to defend that in Boca Raton.
Okay, all right. Yeah, now, I can do that. I can do that. Yeah.
I want to move sideways for just a minute, then we're going to come back to this theme. One of the problems that I've always had around budgets is that their inflation index is the CPI, right? The Consumer Price Index. And when I look at the CPI number and I compare that with the deterioration of the purchasing power of my savings, I notice a rather large gap. I understand part of it, but I'm, as you know, a speculator and a loan shark. I'm not a government guy.
Yeah.
The first thing I see is that when it's inconvenient for them, they don't add food or fuel. I drive and I eat. So any index that doesn't include lunch doesn't appeal to me.
Right. Or it keeps you warm in the dead of winter, right? Yeah.
Probably a bigger problem for me is that their cost of living index, I realize they don't call it that, but they feature it as that, doesn't include tax. Yeah. And the idea that they include from the index the largest single household expense that most Americans face seems farcical to me. When I look at the escalation of the cost of the basket of goods and services that I consume in the period 2000 to 2025, my suspicion is that my savings are deteriorating at more like 7.5% compounded than 2.6. Do you have any comment on the CPI and whether or not, never mind Washington, whether or not Americans should pay attention to it?
Well, I agree with you. It undermeasures inflation systematically and substantially. And the more years you add together of undermeasured inflation, the bigger gap you have in terms of what the dollar really purchases versus what the CPI indicates. Now, there are a lot of different inflation indices. And naturally, this is an important point for our discussion here. The shortest ruler, okay, let's call them the inflation rulers. The shortest one available is the PCE deflator, personal consumption expenditure deflator, excluding food and energy, okay? And the Fed makes that its benchmark. And so it says, a while back, that particular measure was that particular ruler was falsely measuring inflation at 1.5%, 1.4%, 1.7% a year. And you heard all this palaver from the Fed heads saying, oh my God, we're missing our inflation target from below. We ought to figure out what we can do to stimulate more inflation. They were actually, they actually were saying that from 2012 when Bernanke put us on a formalized 2% inflation target, till about 2020 when inflation finally blew, up to the sky. So they were saying we got too little inflation. This is how far off we are. Now, there are a lot of private measures around that show much higher cumulative inflation over time. I think there's one called the Million Prices Project you can look at. That'll show you a lot more inflation than the PCE deflator. But I say you don't even have to go that far, because they'll the defenders of the establishment status quo will say, oh well, how do we know you're right? The CPI is produced by professionals in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So who are you to say you're wrong? Well, I say, okay, let's take the one measure that comes right out of the BLS. It's called the 16% trim mean CPI. And what's nice about that is that each month they drop the lowest 8% of price declines and the highest 8% of price increases. But every month it's a different basket out of the thousands of prices that go into the CPI. So what this does is it basically takes the outliers out of the system, but it doesn't do something stupid like saying you don't have to have energy or food at all. They're always in there. And so you get a smooth but accurate measure even of the CPI. Now, the reason I say this is that is running now at 3.5%. It's not even close to the 2% target. And frankly, inflation ought to be 0, not 2% anyway. That's just a phony target that provides an excuse to print money. So what I'm saying is that if we would even look at the trim mean CPI, it shows a hell of a lot more inflation than's been on the Fed's so-called radar screen or dashboard with this phony short ruler that they use. I would be happy, to tell you the truth, if we could just get them to use the trim mean CPI, because that would say right now, why are you cutting interest rates? Inflation is not nearly under control yet. And do you want to have another breakout, which is very possible if they keep cutting rates the way they've been doing?
I have a separate problem. Government is neither good nor a service, but for most households, it's in excess of 30% of their total household expense. And the idea that you can compile a price index that doesn't include 30% of the average American's household budget seems very, very odd to me.
It is.
The point I'm trying to make is that when I informally looked at the deterioration of the purchasing power of the basket of goods and services that I consumed, it seemed to me like my purchasing power was declining at 7.5% annually, as opposed to 2.6 or 3.5. What's important about this for me, because remember, I put on an investment conference, is when somebody buys a 10-year treasury and think they're getting a 4.3% yield or 4.2% yield, and they're getting a 4.2% yield in a currency where their purchasing power is declining by 7.5%.
Yeah, they're losing money.
4.2%, they're losing 3%. And that would seem to me, from a saver's point of view, to be concerning. A government guarantee that they absolutely positively will make you 3% poorer every year for 10 years. Any comments?
And again, not only do they guarantee you're going to lose money year after year, but then they urge you to buy the government bond to help them finance this great enterprise we have down on the Potomac. I agree with you on all of that. And it's just that we have economic statistics that were basically designed and formulated in the 1930s by early Keynesian economists. They have been perfected and refined and tweaked ever since. But the whole statistical basis of what we use, that is the GDP and all the subcomponents of the GDP and the wholesale price index and the consumer price index, all the rest of it, come out of a Keynesian formulation of economic reality that's false. And so therefore you have to know that bias is there and not get carried away like you see the markets every day get all excited or depressed for a 1/10 of a point difference in GDP growth or a slight slowdown of the CPI. none of that should be the basis for any conclusions at all. If you're an investor or you're just trying to make ends meet with your household finances and budget.
So, David, probably the first time I ever heard you speak, you talked about the fact that you trained for your role leading the Office of Management and Budget by going to divinity school. And I'm going to get you a little close now because I want to talk about the politics of the debt and the politics of the budget. It seems to me that everybody who is listening to you today will find more than one thing to hate in your proposals to trim the budget.
Sure.
One person's necessary protections are somebody else's irrelevant expenditures.
Yep.
One
Right.
person's necessary subsidy is somebody else's unnecessary fat.
Yep.
It seems to me that what we do with all of this, to the extent that we can politically, is that we honor the nominal allegation, the nominal obligations, and we inflate away the net present value. I remember the decade of the 70s when your own Office of Management and Budget suggested that the purchasing power of the US dollar in 10 years deteriorated by 75%.
Mm-hmm.
My own suspicion is that they take some old rich codger like Rick Rule, and he's getting whatever he's getting, $4,000 a month in Social Security. And although they probably shouldn't pay me,
Yeah.
they will. The problem is that the $4,000 will buy $600 worth of goods and services
Right.
in 10 years. It seems to me that the politics of the debt and the politics of the deficit are that you attempt as best you can to honor the nominal obligation, but you default on the installment plan.
And that's kind of that's what was going on for a while. But then we got this idea that generated in the 70s when we had the real high inflation, the double digits, the whole 1970s scenario. And they said, oh, we can't allow that nominal payment to deteriorate in purchasing power. So we're going to index all of these programs. So they indexed everything, Social Security, food stamps, all the rest of it, but they even over-indexed it. In other words, they not only solved the problem allegedly, but they made it even worse. So that's only compounded where we are. But you can't inflate your way out of the entitlements because most of them, that's what I'm saying here, is most of them are indexed for at least the CPI version of inflation. And, that means, for instance, that we're spending like 1.3 trillion this year on Social Security. It'll be 2 trillion before long, and then 3 trillion, and then 4 trillion, partly because the retired population is going from around 60 million to 80 million 10 years from now, and then ultimately 100 million, but mainly because the price level keeps going up, or assumed to go up, by 2 to 3% a year. So the old idea that you could totally inflate your way out of, the fiscal mess that we're in, I don't think works. It's another reason why I think we're in the fast phase of when things go to hell in a handbasket.
So let's put ourselves in the shoes of our attendees. First of all, we hate this discussion because narrative is more fun than math. Second of all, the discussion makes us mad because if we're farmers, we like agricultural subsidies. If we're old fat guys that paid in for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, by God, we want to get paid because we paid in. Whoever you are, you have a bitch. You feel, quote, entitled.
Right. That's why they call them that. Yeah.
Aggregate of those entitlements is unfortunately unfundable. My suspicion is we futz around the edges. You probably take away the cap on Social Security taxes, and then you means test Social Security. So old fat guys like me pay but don't get. I get that. But it seems to me that the whole number is so large that even if you do index entitlements, you index them at a number that's substantially below inflation.
Right.
So what is a person to do? let's say somebody in their 30s or 40s, or somebody in their 70s who's concerned about their children and grandchildren. How do they prepare today for the fact that these, quote, entitlements
Yeah.
aren't going to be there?
Well, there's two things I would say. These are really good, profound questions in a way, because there are two things I would say. One, you can't trust the financial markets at all because they're totally rigged by the Fed. The Fed has now painted itself into a terrible corner because of all the money printing over the last 20, 25 years. And so one of the things you have to be totally cognizant of is the risks that you're taking in the bond market, the stock market, the real estate market. It's not what they want you to believe that, set aside a little bit every year and it'll compound and grow and you'll get a return and you'll be ready for retirement 30 years down the road. That's the first thing. The second thing is to recognize that the underlying policy is so unsustainable, so unbalanced that we're going to have much worse times 10, 20, 30 years from now, that people need to live. This is probably really the worst medicine that you could imagine. It's the worst thing you could think of. But even if you have a ample income today, I think it is not wise to have a spending level, a living standard that has been commensurate with that in the past, because you won't save nearly enough to be prepared for the turmoil that's going to be coming at you down the road, which is to say entitlements that may not be payable by the federal government, or an economy that's in such dire inflationary state that you don't have nearly the wealth available that you might otherwise think you have. So I think the message is don't trust the markets today and live on a much leaner ration. I'm talking about people in their 30s and 40s out of current earnings and income than might have been the case, might have been appropriate or sustainable 10 years ago or 30 years ago. The longer that time passes, unfolds here, the more dire is going to be the, collision at the end, and the more you're going to need to have put away for the hard times that are coming. So it's a great case, understanding the future and where we're heading and how unsustainable current policy is. It's a great case for cranking up savings rates much, much higher than they normally would be or they are today, and investing in things that are not, what your broker are telling you are the 10 hot stocks of the moment.
David, I hope that everybody who has listened to this discussion, and everybody that I will do my best to cause to listen to it between now and the conference, takes what you said to heart and understands the math of America. I hope, too, that you bring a whole bunch of copies of this new book.
Okay, we'll do that, definitely.
And I hope that anybody who buys the book between now and then and presents it to you in Boca Raton can get it signed by David Stockman.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, we will do that. I think by the time we get there for the conference, there's going to be a lot more broken furniture coming out of the system. We're going to have a debt ceiling crisis. We're going to have another appropriations crisis like we just, we're in the middle of right now. We're going to see some major warfare inside the Trump administration between the Doge boys and what some of the more traditional appointees want to do in their departments. So it'll be even more timely, I guess, is what I'm saying, than it is today.
Like our mutual friend Doug Casey says, It'll be fascinating to watch, hopefully from a distance on a broad screen TV.
Okay, exactly.
Thank you so much for your time, David. I hope you'll be willing to come back on this podcast again. And
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
I look forward to seeing you in person, and I look forward to seeing all of our attendees today, either on person or at the Natural Resources Investment Symposium from the comfort and convenience of your own home via live stream. Remember, if you're watching this and you're not familiar with our symposium, whether or not you attend live or whether or not you attend live stream, if you don't think you got your money's worth, unlike our government, I will give you a 100% no questions asked refund. All of the financial risk is mine. You will hear information, like from David Stockman, that you really don't like. But I think all of this information is important to you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. David, thank you. I look forward to seeing you in Boca Raton.
See you there. Look forward to it.